The Yak-38M brings vertical takeoff and landing to the Soviet air tree in War Thunder. Let's check it out. During the 1960s, a number of countries were experimenting with vertical takeoff and landing jet aircraft, including the Soviet Union. The first Soviet VTOL jet was the Yak-36. It looked kinda like a MiG-9 with rotating engine nozzles down under the center of gravity and a boom sticking out of the front. It used a combination of engine thrust and ducted air for vertical flight and control. Despite the fact that it worked, the aircraft had basically no military potential, and it was purely a research aircraft. Later in the 60s, Soviet planners realized that their lack of fixed-wing aircraft carriers was a pretty major strategic weakness, and they made the decision to start developing the Kiev-class aircraft carriers. The Yak Design Bureau was tasked to develop a VTOL fighter for the new ships, mainly due to their experience with the Yak-36, and they set about using what they had learned to produce the Soviet Navy's first fixed-wing, carrier-based fighter. The design of the Yak-38 was highly innovative for the time. It used a combination of two small lift jet engines behind the cockpit, with rotating main engine nozzles to achieve vertical flight, along with ducted air vents for directional control in a hover. It had a fully automated landing system, allowing pilots to do a hands-off landing, as well as a redundant control system that was well ahead of its time. As was normal for first-generation VTOL fighters, it took a couple of years to refine the aircraft into a combat-capable plane. The Yak-38 began carrier operations with the Soviet Navy in late July 1976, and over the next several years, tactics and procedures were developed around the new jet. It was originally hoped that the Yak-38 would be suitable for air superiority missions, but its air combat performance was found pretty lackluster, and Soviet tactics evolved to focus on using the aircraft for interception and anti-shipping strikes. An evaluation unit of 4 Yak-38s was deployed to Afghanistan during 1980, and its weapons system was rated as highly accurate during the very small number of combat operations that took place over the period of about 2 months. The Yak-38M was introduced in 1982 and had slightly improved engines and new air intakes. Otherwise, it was basically the same as the earlier model of the plane. In total, around 200 single-seat Yak-38s were produced, including about 50 of the upgraded M version. What we get in War Thunder is the Yak-38M, a naval strike aircraft and rank 6 of the Soviet air tree with a battle rating of 9.7. There's also a premium Yak-38, the original non-upgraded model, with almost identical characteristics, so everything in this review pretty much applies to both planes. The Yak-38 doesn't carry any radar or countermeasures, but it does get a radar warning receiver and a ballistics computer for its unguided rockets and cannons. It doesn't get any ballistic aids for dumb bombs, though. In terms of loadouts, the plane has 4 external hardpoints that can carry a variety of air-to-ground weapons, including bombs, rockets, guided missiles, and gun pods, as well as air-to-air missiles. I normally don't go into a lot of detail about unguided rockets in these reviews, but in this case, the Yak-38 gets 2 exceptionally strong choices, the S-8KO and the S-24B. Both of these are excellent weapons, and combined with the CCIP, they can be really effective in close air support. The guided anti-tank missile it gets is the KH-23M. This is a manual command line-of-sight weapon with reasonable hitting power and pretty good range. Personally, I'm horrible at using these beyond like 1 kilometer, but if you can get hits with them, they do pop tanks pretty easily at this BR range. Taking the KH-23M will also add a mandatory targeting pod to one of the inbound pylons. The air-to-air missile is the R-60. This is the rear aspect infrared version with 30 Gs of pull, but very short range and a somewhat light warhead. It locks and tracks very well due to its large seeker aperture, but that also makes it chase flares really easily. The flight performance of the Yak-38M, quite frankly, leaves a lot to be desired. The good news is that it has really good engine performance, with strong acceleration and a pretty good rate of climb, plus it rolls very well. That's about where the good news ends. Its wings don't rip until around 1200 kilometers an hour, but you're never going to see those speeds. The plane tops out just below Mach 1 in most situations. Plus, its low-speed performance isn't very good, and it has a somewhat high stall speed compared to other aircraft in pure horizontal flight mode. To make matters worse, it has an exceptionally high wing loading for such a small single-seat jet fighter, which brings us to the primary failing of the Yak-38. It just can't turn. Now, this plane has very small wings, conventional-style tail elevators, and 2 engines worth of pure dead weight just behind the cockpit. This is the primary reason for the crappy maneuverability in air combat. The tail surfaces already give reduced directional force compared to an all-moving tail on something like an F-100 or a MiG-21, but that reduced force also has to swing around a huge chunk of dead weight forward from the center of gravity and the center of lift. Think back to high school geometry and angular momentum. The small wings and weak tail controls just don't provide enough directional force to swing the nose around in aerobatic maneuvers. This can even make it difficult to recover from a dive if you nose down too far. Oh, and no air brake. Overall, the Yak-38M feels a lot like flying a subsonic F-104A, and that's not a good thing. The last thing to mention is that the Yak-38 can't use its lift engines for thrust vectoring and forward flight the way that the Harrier can with its main engine nozzles. So, sorry folks, the VTOL capability can't be used to boost turning performance with this one. It's just never going to be a dogfighter. Taking the Yak-38M into air battles can often be pretty painful. Just about everybody knows that this thing doesn't dogfight very well, and they're going to trip over themselves to get into combat with it as soon as you're spotted by the enemy team, smelling an easy kill. Adding to this is the lack of a radar that reduces your situational awareness quite a bit, and the lack of countermeasures. Well, that's more of a problem than it used to be. The Yak-38 has an enormous thermal signature, and in fact, you can overheat the engine in this thing if you stay at full throttle for too long. Well, why does that matter? It's because in the current meta at the start of 2023, you are almost always going to be paired up against American teams full of premium A6Es and A10s with all-aspect AIM-9 Limas that can lock you from several kilometers away from any direction. If they get one off on you, there's almost nothing you can do about it. Now, I know, you can try and fire an R-60 at the incoming missile from point-blank range. Technically, that works, even though it's incredibly hard to do it reliably. Or you could try taking a rocket pod as like a makeshift flare dispenser that fires forwards. But let's keep it real here. In a practical sense, the Yak-38 is just pretty defenseless against the 9L, and the inclusion of that missile at BR-10 is basically a hard counter to the Yak-38 due to the heat that it puts out. My best advice for air combat is to try and position yourself for boom and zoom attacks at medium altitude against targets that are below you and don't have flares. Or just do your best and try to get lucky. But the sad reality is that the Yak-38 is just gonna lose a one-on-one turn fight about 99% of the time. Adding to this, it has a very light bomb load, which makes it pretty ineffective at base bombing for points grinding or anything, so really it's just a struggle bus in air battles these days. Now if you fly it out into ground battles, it can be a different story. The reduced situational awareness without, like, the built-in spotting can let you get the jump on unsuspecting air targets with the R-60s a little bit more often, if your own visual spotting is good. Plus, the CCIP ballistics computer, combined with some really good unguided rocket options, can actually allow for you to get some reasonably effective close air support kills, so long as nobody shoots at you, since, again, no flares. Now, technically, the Yak-38 can also be used to capture objective points in ground battles by landing on them, but that's much harder with this plane than it is with the Harrier or a helicopter. Possible, but gimmicky and difficult. Visually, I absolutely love the Yak-38. I think this is an amazing looking jet, and frankly, it probably looks better than it flies. There are 3 custom paint jobs available, a light blue, a dark blue, and a camouflage one, and all 3 look great. The cockpit of the Yak-38 is pretty good. The visibility's decent, the instruments are mostly in convenient spots, and the sight is easy to use. The only real downside is the lack of a visible radar warning receiver, but otherwise good cockpit. Okay, so the VTOL stuff. The control you want to set is the axis for thrust vectoring. I use my mouse wheel for this, which ends up being pretty convenient. To take off, just rotate your nozzles all the way down and throttle up. That's simple. Once you get to around 200 to 300 meters, start slowly rotating your nozzles back to around 45 degrees. After you hit 400 kilometers an hour in level flight, you can safely nozzle back to 0 and begin conventionally flying. For a short takeoff, just set your nozzles to between 45 and 55 degrees and throttle all the way up. You'll be surprised how quickly that gets you into the air, but once again, you're going to want to wait until you're at around 400 kilometers an hour in forward flight before you nozzle back to 0. For vertical landings, the Yak-38 can be a bit more difficult to land than the Harrier is. No air brake, so you're going to need to zigzag around and stuff to get your speed down to around 300 kilometers an hour with the nozzles all the way back. This will open your extra intake and engage the VTOL mode, and from there you can drop your gear and use a careful combination of pitch and roll to line up for landing and bleed off speed while managing the throttle. It's a lot to do at the same time. Landing at around 80% throttle seems to be the sweet spot to avoid floating just above the ground or damaging the gear. If you want to make it easier, you can slow down to a little under 200 kilometers an hour and engage your keybind for the hover mode. That'll set the throttle to relative controls and it'll stabilize your directional flight, making it quite a bit simpler to land. To close out on the Yak-38M. This jet has strong acceleration and rate of climb. It can take 4 30G air-to-air missiles at a relatively low BR. It gets the CCIP for its unguided rockets. It can carry a guided air-to-ground anti-tank missile. And it can do VTOL stuff. However, it's subsonic, it has no radar, it has no countermeasures in a bracket full of AIM-9Ls, and it just doesn't turn. The final verdict on the Yak-38M is that in air battles, the plane can be a bit of a struggle bus, and it just isn't competitive in air combat, nor is it really effective at points grinding through ground pounding. In ground battles, it's a bit more useful, but overall it's a hard sell because there are far superior close air support options at this BR. As always, thanks for watching.